this must go like there. Must be there. And this will be the last one here. Oh, no. Who do you think that is? I'll give you a clue. It's a famous English king. So who is it?
Come on, no Googling. Who is this stern and bony monarch?
Now, you smart people out there, the ones who come here to the National Portrait Gallery, you got it straight away, I know. The giveaway, of course, is the nose. The way it's flattened. There's something walrusy about it. But some of you didn't get it, right? And the reason you didn't recognize immediately that this is Henry VIII is because this isn't the Henry we've all got up here in our imaginations. The Henry who had 6 wives, who took on the Pope, who destroyed the monasteries. That Henry didn't look like this. He looked like this. Now that's what you call Henry VIII.
Look at the way he stands, like a Tudor gunslinger at Ye OK Corral. The mighty torso, the sheer width of the man. This is a king who could change history.
That's the Henry who lives up here in our thoughts. Henry the Terrible, the widest king in Christendom. And he is the creation of a particularly important artist. An artist who I would argue didn't just record British history, he actually changed it.
He was a funny little man, a German from Bavaria, a genius who looked like a farmer, called Johannes or Hans Holbein.
This is Holbein's great gift to the world, the iconic image of Henry VIII, which everyone recognises. And Holbein didn't stop there.
How do we know what Sir Thomas More, that conscienceful man for all seasons who stood up to Henry, looked like? Because of Holbein. How do we know what Henry's unfortunate queens looked like? Because of Holbein. And how do we know what Thomas Cromwell, Henry's go-to man for destroying the monasteries, really looked like? Because of Holbein.
Holbein didn't just describe Tudor England, he gave it an extraordinarily active presence, made it feel real. And by making Tudor England immortal, he changed history. Because a slab of history we can envisage so clearly will always trump all those other slabs of history we can't envisage at all.
Why are we so obsessed with Henry VIII and his damned wives? Because of Holbein. Holbein was from here, Augsburg in Bavaria, where he was born in 1497.
His father was a painter, and a really good one, Hans Holbein the Elder. He painted religious pictures. This is one of his.
He designed stained glass as well, so his son, trained by his father, would have imbibed all these profound Catholic moods from birth.
Here at the museum in Augsburg, they've got one of Holbein the Elder's finest pictures. This is the Basilica of St. Paul, as it's called, an altarpiece which tells St. Paul's story. Over here, he's having his head cut off on the orders of the Emperor Nero.
Apparently, the head bounced 3 times when it hit the ground, causing 3 miraculous fountains to spurt from the earth.
But what I really want to show you is this scene on the left, because that old man there with the straggly beard, that's actually Holbein the Elder. And below him are his 2 sons, Ambrosius, the older one with the curly hair, and next to him, little Hans Holbein, future painter of Henry VIII.
So the dad trains the son to be a painter. And when the son is 17, he comes here to Basel in modern Switzerland.
Basel was famous for its printing, the European capital of books. And that must have been what brought the young Holbein here. He was looking for work as a book illustrator.
Basel's greatest printer was a man called Johann Froben. Froben was both a publisher and a scholar, so he was adventurous and informed, and Holbein was soon working for him.
Froben produced lots of important books, but he's particularly well known for publishing the work of that celebrated Dutch naysayer, Erasmus of Rotterdam.
And yes, Holbein painted Erasmus too, tucked up for winter in his study, busily writing.
Erasmus actually came to Basel specifically to work with Froben. And it was Froben who published the best edition of Erasmus's most celebrated work. A hilarious send-up of the modern world called In Praise of Folly.
Just about everyone gets a kicking in Praise of Folly. Young people, women, gamblers. But Erasmus comes down particularly hard on the clergy, the priests, the bishops, and the friars.
Holbein was just 17 when he got hold of a copy of In Praise of Folly, and in the margins, he drew all these funny little drawings.
It's like something a naughty schoolboy might do. Draw all over a famous book. This chap here is walking along the road when he sees a beautiful woman. And he's so busy staring at her, he steps into a basket of eggs. Ah! And this is a monk who's taken the vow of poverty. So he can only touch money with this weird money-touching implement. However, with his other hand, he can touch whatever he wants, as you can see.
It's impressively rude. How can a 17-year-old boy know this much already about sex, greed, human stupidity? The Holbein who emerges here is an instinctive subversive, a mickey taker who sides with Erasmus to poke fun at the world around him.
So a good question is, where did it all go? Did Holbein suppress all this precocious knowledge of the dark workings of men? Or did it sometimes poke out and reveal itself?
When you're as talented as this, when you've got this much speed and inventiveness in your fingers, people quickly notice. So Holbein was soon busy.
The thing he was really good at was religious painting. This is the dead Christ that the young Holbein painted for the base of a Basel altarpiece. It's a coruscating piece of religious realism. But he could do Catholic fluffiness as well. Like this gorgeous Madonna and Child standing in a niche in Darmstadt. Look at the brilliant foreshortening of Jesus' hand. Leonardo himself would have been proud of that.
So it was all going spiffingly. His religious art was in demand. The book trade was keeping him busy when along came Martin Luther and his Protestant Reformation. And suddenly, everything changed.
In a Lutheran world, there was no longer much demand for Catholic Madonnas standing ornately in golden niches. The printing industry too began to flounder. Who should it publish? The Protestants or the Catholics?
With the publishing world caught in this dangerous crossfire and the religious commissions drying up, Holbein needed to find work somewhere else. And that's where Erasmus made himself useful.
Erasmus had actually written in praise of folly in England. He'd spent several years there, teaching at Oxford and Cambridge. And in 1526, Holbein, armed with a letter of introduction from Erasmus, set off looking for work to England.
When he gets here to England, he's in his late 20s. So he's still a young artist, but already very experienced. The unexpected thing, though, about Holbein's arrival in Henry VIII's England is that the one thing he didn't have much experience of was painting portraits.
In Basel, Holbein had been known chiefly as a religious artist. He'd painted one or two portraits, yes, and they were really good. But they were exceptions in his output.
England, though, had never had much of an appetite for Madonnas and Christs. That kind of thing was best left to the Italians. In England, the art form that was most esteemed and which seemed most in tune with the national psyche was portraiture.
The staircases of England were lined with ancestors showing off their bloodlines. To succeed in England, Holbein needed to change tack.
Erasmus had given him an introduction to one of the most influential men at the court. Writer, statesman, theologian, and, as it later transpired, Catholic martyr, Sir Thomas More.
Holbein seems to have spent most of his first year in England living in More's house in Chelsea. He was working on this, a hugely ambitious group portrait of More and his very large family. Unfortunately, this is a copy, and not a very good one. The original was destroyed by a fire in the 18th century. All that's left of the real Holbein is a stack of these astonishingly vivid drawings.
Oh, and there is something else, of course. This. Holbein's great portrait of Moore, which they have here at the Frick Collection in New York.
Moore was the man who famously stood up to Henry, who refused to accept the king as the new head of the church. So Henry had him beheaded.
Now, I was brought up believing that Sir Thomas More was a man of great principle. That's why the Catholic Church made him a saint in 1935.
But more recently, a different Thomas More has been proposed to us. In today's histories, he's often presented as a demented religious bigot, a cruel slayer of the heretics.
That's what modern novelists and playwrights have been making of More. But it's not what Holbein makes of him. And Holbein was there.
I know it's a cliche, and it's been said 1,000 times, but you really do feel he's standing there before you. One of the most resolute presences in British art.
Just look at the details, the way the velvet has been painted, or his perfectly observed skin tones, with that utterly convincing 5 o'clock shadow.
This sense of actuality is new. Not just in British art, but anywhere. These first English portraits of Holbein's make Doctor Who's of us all, TARDISing us back in time to meet a Tudor cast that feels astonishingly present. Just there, right in front of us. Holbein's first visit to England lasted just 2 years, before the fates conspired to bring him home to Basel.
He was busy enough, that wasn't the issue, but as a citizen of Basel, he could only leave the city for a short time, or he'd lose his citizenship. So in 1528, he had to come back.
It was probably now that he painted his wife and children. He'd had to leave them behind when he left for England. And, as you can see, he's made them into a holy family, hasn't he? A suffering Madonna and her infants, dreading what lies ahead.
Basel in 1528 was not a nice place to be if you were a painter or a Catholic. Holbein had seen the Protestant Revolution arriving in Basel. It was one of the reasons he'd left for England. But in the time he was gone, it had all gotten so much worse.
Basel officially became a Protestant city in 1529. To celebrate, gangs of rabid iconoclasts rampaged through the churches, looking for Madonnas to trample and Christs to smash.
On the 9th of February, 1529, a gang of some 200 angry Lutherans broke into here, Basel Cathedral, and began attacking the art. statues, crucifixes, Holbein paintings. And they didn't stop until all this superstitious idolatry, as they saw it, was destroyed.
There's no official record of Holbein's own religious views. Not surprisingly, he kept them to himself. But he was born a Catholic in very Catholic Bavaria. And my hunch, based on the odd visual clue here and there, is that he never crossed over fully to the Lutheran side.
What's definite is that work was now hard to come by. The iconoclasts had seen to that. In a world without images, there was no longer much need for a painter.
Holbein didn't leave immediately. There was his wife and children to worry about. But in 1532, having put his affairs in order, he left Basel again and set off once more for England. And this time he'd be working not just in royal circles, but for the king himself. And what a king he was.
Holbein came to England because he was following the money, as artists do, getting away from Basel, getting away from the iconoclasts. He came here looking for prosperity and peace. Instead, he found Henry VIII.
And for him to be here while Henry beheaded his wives, took on the Pope, brutally enforced his new religion, is so damn fortunate, it almost feels preordained. Holbein didn't begin working for the king as soon as he returned to London. His first patrons actually came from here.
It's changed a bit, of course, but in Tudor times, this was a very important location for Holbein, because where I'm standing now was the centre of a huge urban complex called the German Steelyard.
The Steelyard wasn't a steel yard. It was a city within a city, a kind of German Hong Kong, created by German merchants for the purposes of international trade.
It had been here since 1320, growing bigger and bigger. And the German merchants in here, they didn't pay any tolls or customs. They were privileged foreigners. And inside this walled community of theirs, they had warehouses, shops, offices, taverns.
So this was a home from home for Holbein. And when he returned to England in 1532, the rich German merchants of the Steelyard were his first customers. This handsome young chap, who now hangs in Windsor Castle, is Derek Bourne from Cologne, who supplied the court of Henry VIII with military equipment for the army. In Holbein's time, just like today, if you wanted precision, quality, and Vorsprung durch Technik, you bought German.
The paintings that Holbein made of the merchants of the German Steelyard seem to speak a different language from his other English pictures. It's as if some of that different mindset that had poked out in Praise of Folly pokes out here as well.
This exceptionally fine fellow is Georg Gies, a merchant from Danzig. He's sitting in his office in the German steel yard, surrounded by the accoutrements of his trade, his pens, his documents, the box in which he keeps his money.
And all these details which have been described so perfectly by Holbein have other meanings, secret little messages that have been smuggled into the picture.
In particular, notice the beautiful Venetian vase with its fragile pink carnations. How skillfully Holbein has painted the shifting reflections in the glass, and how precariously the vase is balanced on the edge of the table.
Whenever you see something on the edge of a table in art, it always means the same thing. Isn't life precarious? It's the same with the money box. How easily George Gies's stash of cash could topple and fall.
The precarious vase, the lovely reflections, are all brilliant Holbeinian reminders of the shortness of life. Just like the reflections in the glass, all this can disappear in an instant. It's a message that's always relevant, but it was particularly relevant in the shifting, fracturing England of Henry VIII. Holbein obviously didn't know what he was letting himself in for in Henry VIII's England. Had he known, he would surely have turned tail and returned home. You know, between the age of 5 and 11, I used to walk down this road pretty much every day of my life. We lived up there in Caversham, in Reading, and this was my way to school every day for 6 years. And not once in that time did I ever consider the significance of this road. My school was down here, down the alley. I used to love walking down here. The school was a Catholic primary school run by nuns called St. Anne's. A nice, friendly, ordinary school next door to a church. The church was also called St. Anne's, and back then I didn't know what had actually happened here in Holbein's time, but I do now. St. Anne's, Caversham had a famous statue in it. She was called Our Lady of Caversham, and she was said to have miraculous powers. The shrine of Our Lady of Caversham was one of the most visited locations in Tudor England. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to pray to her for help. One of them was the rightful Queen of England, Catherine of Aragon, who came here to Caversham on the 17th of July, 1532, to pray for her husband, Henry VIII. It was the Queen's final plea to her God, begging him to intervene and stop Henry from divorcing her and marrying Anne Boleyn. Of course, it didn't work. Henry went ahead with his divorce. He married Anne Boleyn and made himself the supreme head of a new English church. And a few years later, he took his revenge
on Our Lady of Caversham.
On the 14th of September 1538, a gang of government agents arrived at St. Anne's and closed down the famous shrine. Our Lady of Caversham was bundled into a cart and taken to London.
The gold and the silver in which the statue was covered was stripped off and sent to the king. And the actual wooden statue, well, that was burned.
The man who organised all this destruction and who jotted off a quick note to his agents to congratulate them on a job well done was, of course, Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell. I bet you were wondering when we'd get to him.
Now, when I was at school, Cromwell was recognised by everyone as a terrible man. Henry VIII's enforcer, the destroyer of the monasteries. In recent years, though, there's been this big reassessment. And the modern image of him, the one you find today in plays and books, is of a decent and brilliant man who's trapped in a difficult situation.
Cromwell, we're now told, was an early civil servant who channeled power away from the monarchy and who invented the modern bureaucratic state.
These days, we're encouraged to see Thomas Cromwell as a good guy. But in this film, I'm not going to do that for two important reasons. This is one of them.
What Cromwell did to Our Lady of Caversham, the ruination he visited upon England's artistic past, is unforgivable. And the second reason for not whitewashing Thomas Cromwell is this: Holbein's portrait of him.
Just look at him. What a hard and charmless presence. Those piggy eyes, that blank expression. Cromwell is surely the least attractive sitter in the whole of Holbein's art.
This was painted at the outset of Cromwell's campaign against the monasteries in 1533. It shows him in his office with his quills and his documents, inventing the modern bureaucratic state.
According to various conspiratorial whispers doing the rounds, Cromwell actually used Holbein to spy on the German community in the Steelyard. That's how Holbein ended up working for the English court.
It's certainly true that Cromwell had spies everywhere. But is Holbein really thanking him for his assistance in this grim portrayal? Was he really the good guy? And was Thomas More over here really the bad guy?
Fortunately, because of Holbein, who was actually there, who knew them both, who happened to be the greatest portraitist of his times, here at the Frick Collection in New York, we're in a perfect position to decide.
So, who is the goodie here and who's the baddie? Where Holbein stands on the matter is surely pretty obvious. Holbein officially entered the service of the king in 1535. He was paid £30 per year, which, even in those days, wasn't very much.
And since this was the court of Henry VIII, there were immediately problems. Holbein's first supporter in England, Sir Thomas More, had risen to the rank of Lord Chancellor, but he refused to accept the king's new position as head of the church, so Henry had him beheaded.
Poor Holbein had no choice, really, but to disassociate himself from his first supporter.
He needed a new patron, and at some point, probably with the connivance of Cromwell, he managed to get on the good side of Anne Boleyn.
How did he do that? With his art, of course. There's a drawing in the Basel Museum of a magnificent gold table fountain he designed for the king's new wife. It would have been covered in pearls and rubies, and the water would have flowed from the breasts of the women below.
So he wasn't just the court portraitist. To earn his £30 a year, Holbein had lots of duties at the court.
He designed the royal jewellery and the royal pendants, the royal cutlery and the royal daggers. He even designed the royal fireplace.
But his chief duty, the one we all know him for today, was to invent a look for Henry VIII that was instantly recognisable. Henry needed portraits of himself to hand out to passing dignitaries, people he was trying to impress. So this wasn't portraiture as a record of how he actually looked. This was portraiture as a weapon of propaganda.
Holbein painted Henry on various occasions. Henry VIII, the extra-wide monarch, ruler of all he surveys. They're splendid, of course, jewel-like and perfect. But they're not exactly revealing, are they?
This is the most celebrated of them. Henry in the classic Henry pose. And this is actually a cartoon or preparatory drawing for a life-sized mural that Holbein painted in Whitehall Palace.
There's a copy of it in Hampton Court. Henry and his parents welcoming visitors to his privy chamber. Imagine walking into a room and being confronted by this lot, life-sized.
The actual painting, the Holbein mural, was destroyed by a fire in the 17th century. There's just this drawing left. But one thing you do get from this is a sense of scale. Look how big the king is.
Holbein was no longer in the business of telling the truth. Instead, he's invented a Henry VIII, so imposing and wide that no one dared argue with him. It was a task accomplished in the Mao Zedong manner, with constant repetition and huge exaggerations of scale. By the time the Whitehall mural was painted in 1537, Anne Boleyn had had the Henry treatment. Accused on trumped-up charges of incest, adultery and witchcraft, she was beheaded on the 19th of May, 1536, while Cromwell watched from the wings. The next day, Henry was betrothed to one of her maids-in-waiting, the pale and placid Jane Seymour.
Jane Seymour would actually be standing about here in the Whitehall mural, in the bit that's missing. But don't worry, we know exactly what she looked like because Holbein has also left us a portrait of her.
It's a lovely thing and hangs now in Vienna in the Kunsthistorische Museum. But here too there's a distance, a lack of touchable humanity. A beautiful queen in beautiful clothes. She's like one of those precious pendants that Holbein designed for the court. A human jewel.
Jane Seymour didn't last long, just 1 year. Having given birth to the male heir that Henry craved so desperately, she died tragically from complications brought on by the royal birth.
The son she bore, the future Edward VI, was also painted by Holbein in this fiercely frontal image. He's got Henry's cheeks, that's for sure, but his real face is hiding in the middle.
With the death of Jane Seymour, that was 3 wives down and 3 to go for Henry. But having run out of maids-in-waiting at court, he widened the search for wife number 4 by assembling a new list of the best European princesses.
Poor Holbein found himself involved intimately in this hunt when he was sent across the Channel to paint portraits of Henry's prospective brides, so the king could choose the prettiest. Welcome to the Hans Holbein dating agency.
The first princess, Christina of Denmark, was just 16 when Henry approached her. Christina was famously beautiful. Just how beautiful you can see immediately from Holbein's superb, full-length portrait of her.
Although she was so young, Christina was already a widow, having been married briefly to the Duke of Mantua. That's why she's wearing black in Holbein's towering likeness.
Apparently, Holbein had just one sitting with Christina in Brussels, which lasted 3 hours. But the drawing he produced in those 3 hours, with those lightning-fast fingers of his, was all he needed to paint this.
It's his finest and most ambitious female portrait. Not surprisingly, Henry wanted immediately to marry Christina of Denmark. Who wouldn't? But Christina was lucky. She turned him down. So Holbein was sent back across the Channel to search further for prospective brides. And this time, it was a German princess, Anne of Cleves, who needed to be examined.
Interestingly, Anne of Cleves was painted on paper, presumably so the picture could be rolled up more easily and taken back to England. And it was painted with egg tempera, which dries much more quickly than oil paints. So this was done in a hurry.
It's a peculiar picture. Look how she stares straight out at us. You can't look natural staring like that. Holbein's art was beginning to stiffen.
The king didn't mind. He liked Holbein's portrait of Anne so much, he married her. But the marriage was a famous disaster. When Henry saw what she really looked like in the flesh rather than in Holbein's portrait of her, he found her, and this is his word, not mine, repulsive. So, the marriage was never consummated and quickly annulled. But at least Anne of Cleves got out of it alive.
Not everyone was as fortunate.
Cromwell, who'd sent Holbein to Europe to paint Anne,
was blamed for the mistake. And a few weeks after the wedding, he was accused of treason and beheaded. Holbein had fetched up in a historical nightmare. This is Catherine Howard, wife number 5. She lasted just over a year before Henry got crazily jealous again. And she too was beheaded. As for wife number 6, Catherine Parr, there is no Holbein portrait of her, so we have no idea what she looked like.
so that's one generation goeth, and another generation cometh, and the earth abideth forever. Ecclesiastes.
Holbein's most famous painting, in the National Gallery in London, is usually called The Ambassadors. But that's just its modern name.
It's only been called that since the end of the 19th century. A more revealing and more accurate name would be something like, "Don't worry, it'll soon be over."
The Ambassadors shows 2 of Holbein's most suave sitters. He is Jean de Danteville, French ambassador to the court of Henry VIII. And this is his French friend, Georges de Selve, Bishop of Lavaux.
So these 2 commissioned the picture, and now they're standing there, leaning casually on this shelf here, packed with all these symbols. Interestingly, and very relevantly, we know exactly how old they are because Holbein's put it in the picture. Over here, on de Danteville's dagger, it says et sue 29. He is 29 in Latin. And up here, on this book, on which de Selva's leaning, etati sue 25. He is 25. So, an ambassador who's 29 and a bishop who's 25. Now that's young, isn't it?
So, it goes there. Lots of complex meanings have been proposed for the ambassadors. Trying to understand the picture has become a mini industry.
Most of the mystery has centred on this thing here, the famous Holbein's skull, which is distorted so heavily you can only see it from the side, from over here, and from pretty high up.
Why the skull is distorted is pretty obvious, as I'll be showing you in a moment. Why it's in the picture, what it's doing here, is more than obvious. It's completely unmissable.
Here, I'll show you. Oh, and you also need to notice that crucifix hidden behind the curtain at the top, because that is the most important symbol in the picture. This is by Harman Steenweg, painted much later, but as you can see, it's got another skull in it. And this messy heap of objects, just like the ambassadors.
It's what's called a vanitas picture. Vanitases appeared in Northern Renaissance art in the 15th century.
This word vanitas comes from here, from the Bible, and the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a wonderful doomy passage right at the beginning, which goes in Latin, vanitas vanitatum, omnia vanitas. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity.
This, though, isn't about vanity in the modern sense. All those TV presenters looking at themselves in the mirror. This is biblical vanity, where nothing lasts forever.
So what this picture's doing is reminding us all of the ultimate uselessness of life. And all this stuff in here, the flute, the books, that beautiful Japanese sword, all that is here today, gone tomorrow. Because what awaits us all, where we're all heading, is here.
You can see the same meaning in another famous picture at the National Gallery by Frans Hals.
In the Frans Hals, the young man is looking at a skull because that's his future. However young you are, this is where it'll end. So, back at the Holbein, all this stuff here, the things on the shelves, are like the objects piled up in the Steenweg. Earthly goodies. Wonderful while you're here, useless when you're not.
The top shelf is packed with scientific instruments for working out the time. Sundials, clocks, celestial globes. The sun riseth, says Ecclesiastes doomily, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to the place where he ariseth.
So all these beautiful instruments for working out the time, all this knowledge, is basically useless. Just a heap of stuff. The bottom shelf, meanwhile, is full of earthly pleasures, things we enjoy. A lute for playing music, this bag of flutes over here. And look, a book of hymns by Martin Luther.
And this is where the picture gets sneaky. Very sneaky. Look again at that lute. Look really carefully. See? One of the strings is broken. And traditionally, a broken string is a symbol of discord. Something's gone wrong.
What's gone wrong is Luther. It's no accident that the Lutheran hymn book is directly below the lute with the broken string. That is a deliberate piece of vanitas symbolism. Remember, when this picture was painted in 1533, no one was sure yet that the Protestant Revolution was going to succeed. How could they have known that? It hadn't happened yet. So what a lot of people would have assumed, particularly a Catholic bishop and the French Catholic ambassador, is that Luther's revolt was just a flash in the pan. That is where the skull comes in. The skull, right at the front of the picture, is so big it trumps everything else.
Compared with this big skull, this little bit of discord here is nothing. So, why is this skull so distorted? Ah, that's where it gets clever. This is Boy Bitten by a Lizard by Caravaggio. So it's another young man, and the lizard is biting him because the lizard in art is traditionally a symbol of old age. And to amplify that meaning, that life is short, very short, Caravaggio's also included this beautiful reflection in the vase.
The reflection, like youth itself, will only last a moment. It's another vanitas symbol.
So in the Holbein, the skull is like the reflection. It can only be seen for a moment, and only if you're over here. I reckon this must have been hanging in a room that you entered from the side, from over here. And when you looked over, you saw the skull, and that was a shock. But then, when you saw the picture from the front, the skull wasn't there anymore. It was gone, because the skull, death itself, is just another vanity.
Like the Lutheran hymn book, like the broken string, like the lifetimes of the bishop and the ambassador. Death means nothing in the end. It's just another illusion. All that really matters, and I told you the crucifix was important, is the eternal truth hidden behind the curtain. In this great and sneaky masterpiece, Holbein is reminding us that the world of Henry VIII, all that discord, all that death, is just like everything else. Here today, gone tomorrow.
Holbein himself didn't last long.
He died in 1543 from what they called the sweating sickness, the plague. He was 45. He left behind some of the greatest portraiture of the Renaissance. A Tudor cast so vivid you can feel their breath on your cheek.
If Holbein hadn't fetched up in England when he did, I'm absolutely certain that we wouldn't be as obsessed with the Tudors as we are. By making the age of Henry VIII so damn tangible, Holbein forced it into our thoughts forever. But you know, when I flick through this, that marvellous folly book he drew when he was a boy, I can't help wondering how much more there could have been.
When you remember the coruscating realism of his religious art, or the pathos and sadness he found in the face of his own wife, when you consider the devious complexity of the ambassadors, that's a lot of might have beens. It wasn't just Anne Boleyn, or Anne of Cleves, or Sir Thomas More, whose misfortune it was to encounter Henry the Terrible. That was Holbein's misfortune too.
Rubens is the nastiest, most vulgar painter that ever lived. His pictures always put me in mind of chamber pots. Ha! Thomas Eakins. So what's this? To my eye, Rubens's colouring is contemptible. His shadows are filthy brown, somewhat the colour of excrement. William Blake. What's this? He's gifted, but he's used his gifts to make nasty things. Picasso? The modern world really has it in for Rubens. It's as if everything he did jars with our sensibilities and goes against our grain.
His religious pictures are completely over the top, aren't they? Too violent, too noisy, too Catholic. His mythologies are even worse. All those fleshy pink gods doing silly things in ridiculous mythological pantomimes. And as for his women, oh my God, Rubens's women. They're just too fat, aren't they? Women in art shouldn't carry this much cellulite.
So that's what people think. But it's not what I think. I think Rubens was one of the most exciting painters the world has seen. Just look at all that invention, that energy, that drama.
So yes, I'm a Rubens man. And in this film, I'm going to try and make all of you Rubens people too.
I was never so disgusted in my life as with Rubens and his eternal wives. Lord Byron, eternal wives. Ah!
When Lord Byron complains about Rubens's eternal wives, he's complaining about all those notoriously large women in Rubens's art. The modern world simply doesn't tolerate women like this, does it?
But why not? Seriously, why not? What's wrong with a few bulges and a bit of cellulite? Don't tell me nobody out there's got any. Even I've got a bit of cellulite.
Besides, if you look back at the art of the past, the best evidence there is of the human worldview, if you go right back to the beginning, you'll see that Rubens's women are the norm, not the exception. This is the Willendorf Venus, the oldest known masterpiece of sculpture. Her task is to ensure human fertility. She's a bringer of life, a good luck charm. And look how fleshy and Rubensian she is.
In any case, not all Rubens's women were like that. They weren't all fleshy housewives. Some of them were women of remarkable power and confidence. I mean, See all this? Everything in this room, this entire Rubensian outpouring, all of it is about one woman. That woman over there. The art-loving Queen of France, Marie de Medici. There she is, being born. As a Medici, she was born in Florence, and that's why there are all these cherubs down here popping out of the River Arno to welcome her. Here she is at school, being educated by the gods.
Apollo is teaching her music. Hermes teaches languages.
Over here, that's the French king, Henry IV, seeing her picture and liking it.
Henry liked it so much, he married her. But don't worry, I'm not going to take you through all of it. There's still most of the room to go. 21 pictures in all, taking up a huge slab of the Louvre. But we're here for Rubens, not for Marie de Medici. And there's a big Rubensian truth I want to tackle in here about the impact of his work.
You know, when you first come in here and you see all this, you're tempted to walk a bit faster, aren't you? To give most of this a miss. Don't worry, we all feel like that. I mean, all this is terrifying, right?
With Rubens, there's so much to look at, isn't there? Too much. His art sometimes forms an impenetrable blob of bodies that frighten you away. Here's a good example.
Rubens's Fall of the Damned.
It's just scary, isn't it? Have you ever seen so many bodies in one picture? But then, when you step closer and start giving it a good look, see what happens. The fleshy blobs start to disentangle themselves and make sense. The details emerge, and they're fascinating. Look at that. Ooh. And that. Ooh. And that. Ah.
The point is, Rubens always gave more than was asked of him. He was so inventive and daring, had so much fun painting his pictures. From a distance, that's not always obvious. From a distance, Rubens can seem frightening. But if you get closer to him, close enough to see what he's actually up to, Rubens is absolutely delightful.
And guess what? You have an ally in this exciting exploration. The camera. The camera loves Rubens. It gets you close enough to see his details, high enough to inspect his corners. Since this painting left Rubens' studio, no one's been able to see it as well as this. So yes, stick with me. Stick with the camera. And let's plunge together into all that Rubens out there. Before we go an inch further into this film, we need to have a geography lesson.
This is a famous map called the Leo Belgicus, and it was brought out in 1609 by a cartographer called Claus Janszoon Visscher, and it shows Western Europe as it was
in Rubens's time.
The lion shows the outline of what used to be called the Spanish Netherlands. Today, it's 3 different countries. Belgium around here, Holland up here, and over here, Luxembourg.
It was called the Spanish Netherlands because all these lands belonged then to the Spanish kings who'd inherited them from the Burgundians. And it was divided up into provinces, 17 of them.
These 17 provinces were split on religious lines. Up here were the Protestants, the Calvinists. Down here, in the Flemish bit, were the Catholics.
So this part and this part were at loggerheads, and in 1568 the simmering tension between the Calvinist north and the Catholic south erupted into a terrible war, one of the most brutal and longest wars in European history, called the 80 Years' War.
Now, Rubens was born in 1577, just after the fighting started. He died in 1640, a few years before it finished. So for his entire life, all 63 years of it, the North was fighting the South. The Catholics were fighting the Protestants. It's the only reality he ever knew.
All that was happening around him all the time. And it's against that backcloth that his life and his art was enacted.
The conflict in the Netherlands stamped on everything. Not just history and maps, but entire families too.
Rubens's father, Jan Rubens, was a lawyer from Antwerp and, interestingly, a Protestant, a Calvinist. And when the 80 Years' War broke out in 1568, this Jan Rubens had to flee from Antwerp to escape an invading Spanish army that had turned up to enforce Catholicism and kill the Protestants.
He fled here to Germany, where there was plenty of work going for a Protestant lawyer.
Unfortunately, that's how he came into contact with this woman here, Anna of Saxony, the local princess, who employed him to sort out some financial matters.
Now, this Anna of Saxony was fascinating, but flawed. Very flawed. She liked to drink, and she liked men. And as her new lover, she chose Jan Rubens.
Jan was also married. He'd brought his wife with him from Antwerp. But when a princess seduces you, all the rules get broken, don't they?
Their affair was short and grubby. Anna got pregnant, and Jan Rubens was quickly imprisoned for the very, very serious crime of adultery with a princess. He was in jail for 2 years. And when they finally let him out, he moved back in with the wife he'd betrayed and proceeded to have more children with her, including in 1577, the year Anna of Saxony died, a son called Peter Paul Rubens.
Now, Rubens's mother, Marie Pieperlinks, seems to have been a rather reluctant Calvinist.
And when Jan Rubens also died in 1587, she took the family back to Antwerp, where they returned to a fully Catholic life, as if nothing had happened.
Rubens was 10 when he arrived in Antwerp. He was put in a Catholic school and then trained as a painter. His talent was obvious, and the new rulers of the Spanish Netherlands, the Habsburg archdukes, Albert and Isabella, were quick to notice him and make him a favourite. But when you look at this early Adam and Eve, painted soon after he finished his apprenticeship, it's worth remembering that the sin of lust was embedded in his childhood. That religion and its conflicts had stamped on his history, and that his betrayed mother was the only religious constant he really knew. Why did Rubens paint so many Madonnas and children? And why are they all so soppy? I think it's because they're personal. Very personal.
The Rubens family house was up here in St. Michaelstraat. Just around the corner, meanwhile, in Kloosterstraat, lived the family of Jan Brandt, an Antwerp lawyer who had a vivacious daughter called Isabella Brandt.
Isabella was charming, sparky, fun to be with, and hard-working. She liked to roll up her sleeves and get things done, which is what Rubens liked to do too.
She lived so close to him they could hardly fail to meet, and soon enough they were courting, and not long after, in 1609, they got married.
Rubens was 32 when he married Isabella. She was 18, but that was normal at the time. They moved into this big house here, the Rubens house. And as he was to do with all the people in his life, Rubens began putting Isabella into his art. Sometimes he did it officially, as in their touching wedding picture in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. Rubens and Isabella sitting in a honeysuckle bower, all loved up and content. Other times, Isabella is lightly disguised. Here she is pretending to be the Virgin Mary looking after the baby Jesus. And I'm pretty sure Jesus is actually their first son, Albert, born in 1614. And if I'm not wrong, and I don't think I am, isn't this her as well, gone blonde for a moment, and popping up so cheekily as a jolly follower of Bacchus in one of Rubens's fleshiest mythologies, the drunken Silenius. They were married for 18 years, until her early death in 1626.
And in that time, God only knows how many Isabella Brandts popped up surreptitiously in her husband's art. In front of Rubens, put on blinkers like those a horse wears. Jean-Auguste Dominic Ingres wrote that. Horse blinkers. Ah! You don't need blinkers to look at Rubens. What you need is a bigger telly. Is there anyone called Chris watching this film? Like Chris Froome, the cyclist, or Chris Martin, the pop singer? Well, if you are watching, all you Chris's out there, this bit of the film is dedicated to you.
Chris's of the world, how often do you consider the true significance of your name? What does Christopher really mean? And what's it got to do with this stupendous Rubens masterpiece, The Descent from the Cross in Antwerp Cathedral?
You have to follow me round here. See that huge fellow up there on the back of the side wings? That is Saint Christopher, and he's carrying Christ across the river. Because Christopher, of course, means carrier of Christ. Now, St. Christopher was the patron saint of an organisation called the Arquebusiers Guild.
The arquebusiers used these things. Arquebuses. A big new gun that revolutionised warfare in the 80 Years' War.
Here in the Spanish Netherlands, with their endless wars, the arquebus was constantly in use. And in Antwerp, the arquebusiers had formed their own militia, a kind of territorial army, whose task was to defend the city. And the president of this Arquebusiers Guild was a man called Nicholas Rokops.
That's him on the left, standing behind the old man. In 1611, Rokops and the Arquebusiers commissioned Rubens to paint a new altarpiece for Antwerp Cathedral. It's his most famous painting, and probably his greatest. But to get back to all you Christophers out there, this idea of carrying Christ is what unites all the bits of this dramatic and magnificent altarpiece.
So in the middle, the dead body of Christ is being carried from the cross. He suffered his terrible crucifixion, and now it's time to bury him. You can really feel the weight of his corpse, can't you, as all these helpers and apostles lower him down from the cross. But it's these women at the foot of the cross towards whom it all seems to be slumping.
On the left, at the bottom, Mary of Cleophas, so youthfully beautiful, sheds a desperate tear. Next to her, Mary Magdalene, the reformed prostitute, lets Jesus' foot rest on her shoulder and makes him suddenly appear weightless.
So everyone here is carrying Christ, and that's what this central panel is about. But over here, on the left, Rubens winds back the clock to the time before Jesus is born, to the so-called Visitation. And there's the Blessed Mary again, the rather unlikely blonde with the red top. And as you can see, she's heavily pregnant.
She's come to visit her cousin, Elizabeth. And she's carrying Jesus in her womb.
These days, the picture's always open, but in Rubens's time, it was often closed. Like that. With St. Christopher over here and the old hermit on the other side. And then, when they opened it, all this was revealed.
It's like 17th century cinema, isn't it? dramatic, emotional, vivid. And all you Christophers out there, I want to thank you for this. Nicholas Rocox, the president of the arquebusiers, who commissioned Rubens's great Descent from the Cross, lived in this house here.
Rocox was the mayor of Antwerp several times, a very powerful and influential man, a good man for Rubens to have on his side. And that's him there, up on the left of this devotional triptych that Rubens painted for him. And his wife, she's on the other side. Lucky old Rocox had Rubens's all round the house. But the one I want to focus on now used to hang here above the fireplace where that Rubens Venus is now. And in Rocox's time, this position here was occupied by a very naughty picture. A picture which calls for some music.
The story of Samson and Delilah is told in the book of Judges. She was a woman from the valley of Sorek. He was an Israelite, famed for his great strength. The Philistines, traditional enemies of the Israelites, promised Delilah money, 1,100 pieces of silver, to find out the secret of Samson's strength. At first, he resisted her, but after a night of intense biblical lovemaking, Samson could resist no more.
So Delilah finds out that the secret of Samson's strength is his long hair. And in the Rubens painting, the Philistines have just arrived at the door, and they've brought a barber with them.
It's such an exciting picture. Rubens doesn't just bring the Bible to life, he sets it on fire. And when you look at Samson, exhausted by all that sweaty sex, just lying there, poleaxed, like a goalkeeper who's banged his head against the post.
So Nicholas Rocox commissions Rubens to paint a big warning about the seductive power of women and to put it above the mantelpiece here where no one can miss it. And what does Rubens do? Well, Rubens paints him one of the sexiest pictures in the whole of Baroque art, an utterly tangible depiction of post-coital exhaustion.
And if you look around Rubens's art of these busy years, you'll find lots of Delilahs scattered about his crowd scenes, tempting the Samsons. All these beautiful blondes don't just look like Delilah, they are Delilah. The same blonde model popping in and out of Rubens's art, like a Baroque Barbara Windsor in a carry-on film. Sometimes, as in this particularly violent depiction of the massacre of the innocents, she's even wearing the same dress. Other times, she's not. So, How does Rubens do it? How does he make his art so vivid? To find out, I've wangled my way into a top-secret Antwerp warehouse, where a team of busy restorers is working on a Rubens Madonna.
Thank you for letting me in here.
It's painted, as most of his best work was painted, not on canvas, but on wood.
Antwerp, in fact, the Antwerp School of Painting is one of the few schools that is still painting on wood in the early 17th century. The tradition of painting on wood in Flanders had a long tradition, of course, since the times of Van Eyck and Bruegel. And on the smooth panels, every brushstroke is visible and remains visible. And so also the difference between these brushstrokes, so very smooth glazing areas, but also the very upstanding, very three-dimensional highlights.
That's a difference that I always notice with Rubens. The surfaces look very kind of liquid almost, as if they haven't quite solidified. There's that brilliant sort of like skating feeling across the painting.
Absolutely. Rubens really loved to paint on a smooth surface. Also on panel, you could paint very differently. So his painting on panel became more, let's say, atmospheric.
Now let's talk about this wood. Where did it come from? I think I read somewhere that a lot of it came from my country, from Poland.
Well, it comes exactly from Poland and the Baltic region. It was, let's say, shipped towards Antwerp, and then when it arrived, it was, of course, cut into planks, and then panels were made. And these panels had standard shapes, they had standard formats.
When you look at Rubens, though, quite often you see the lines, don't you? You can still see the lines where the panels were. So it wasn't made from one panel, it was made from separate pieces.
That has to do with the fact that Rubens, when he developed his ideas, was one of the first painters that didn't take the format for granted. So while he's thinking about his composition, he often enlarges it. And a good example for us is the Madonna with a parrot, which started as a smaller Madonna picture and then completely overworked, completely overpainted. And so it became this very Baroque, very Italianate, large piece.
Maybe we can have a closer look as well.
Absolutely. So the painting was started by Rubens in 1614. And the painting was, in fact, was a standing format from approximately here to there, and high as such.
So just a Madonna and Child?
A Madonna and Child, without a parrot, without St. Joseph, so only the Madonna. Then the painting was still in his studio. He didn't sell it, apparently. And then in 1630, he turned it into something which is far grander, far more monumental, so more an Italianate Venetian painting.
That's so interesting, though. So, can I ask, though, why would he bother doing that? I mean, you've got a picture here, which, you know, by Rubens' standards is quite modest. Why didn't he just start from scratch? Why would he begin to enlarge it like this?
Never waste something that exists and transform it into your idiom of the moment. I think he wanted to get rid of an older Madonna he couldn't sell, or he didn't sell, and
makes it a much more glorious painting.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you what I really like here. This red.
Absolutely.
Well, Rubens is red.
Absolutely.
It's like lipstick on a woman's lips.
That's his color. That's his color. His balance of colors is always turning to the reds. The reds are his.
One of the big criticisms that's always levelled at Rubens is that he churned out too many pictures. His studio was the biggest and busiest in Europe, so there are a lot of Rubenses out there. Too many for one man to have painted. So the worry is his assistants did it all for him.
It's true, he was amazingly prolific, and to achieve all that Rubens achieved did require the assistance of a busy studio. But why is that so terrible? We don't expect an architect to lay all his own bricks, or a composer to play all the instruments. So why in art are we so reluctant to admire a collaborative effort?
Now this little picture is by Rubens and by Jan Bruegel. So's this one. And this one.
They're so petite. Look, 5 exciting little pictures, packed, rammed, with so much stuff.
They're actually allegories of the senses, 5 of them. Each picture a different sense. This one here, with all the flowers, that's the sense of smell. The one with the telescope in it and all the magnifying gizmos, that's sight. And this one, my favourite, with Venus playing a lute and Cupid singing, that's hearing.
The actual music that Venus and Cupid are playing in the picture, and that you're listening to now, is a madrigal by the 16th century English composer Peter Phillips. And all those notes on the table, those are the actual notes.
The musical instruments are perfectly identifiable too. The birds are all birds that are famous for talking. Macaws, a cockatoo, and under the keyboard, a cheeky toucan.
To work out all the symbolism packed into these 5 paintings would take several hours. So my advice to you is to come back here to the Prado one day and to spend the whole day in front of Bruegel and Rubens. You'll really enjoy it.
But why is Rubens working with Bruegel? Who did what in these exciting allegories? And why?
Bruegel was renowned as a still life painter, and he specialised in these busy allegories. He was actually taught to paint miniatures by his grandmother, and some of the detail in this picture is so fine that he had to paint it with a brush that only had 1 hair.
So most of what you see here was painted by Bruegel, who'd lay out the picture and pack it with details. But he'd leave empty spaces for Venus and Cupid. And the picture was then taken round the corner to Rubens's studio, and Rubens would put in the figures.
What an extraordinary way to make pictures. The question is, why bother?
It certainly wasn't because Bruegel couldn't do the figures himself. In his own art, like this bustling country road in Brabant, Bruegel was perfectly capable of doing all sorts of figures.
Bruegel didn't collaborate with Rubens because he couldn't do figures. Bruegel collaborated with Rubens, his friend and neighbour, because their joint achievement was more valuable than an individual achievement.
Bruegel pulled Rubens in a different direction. Their shared accomplishment was something more than a solo accomplishment. And is collaboration really such a bad thing when it gives us art as good as this?
Not more Blake. You must agree that Rubens was a fool, and yet you make him master of your school. Rubens, a fool. He just doesn't get it, does he? Just doesn't get it.
Rubens was anything but a fool. If he'd never been a painter, he'd still have been an important figure in another crucial field of European history: politics.
Rubens was the most politically active and powerful artist there's ever been. He was the Henry Kissinger of his times. To have achieved what he did in politics while keeping down his day job as Europe's greatest painter was remarkable.
To give you a sense of the twisted political realities of Rubens's world, here's his head of Medusa, painted in 1617. See Medusa's hair, how knotted and slimy and slippery it is. Well, the politics of Rubens's world were like that.
To understand what was going on in Rubens's day between Spain, France, England, the Spanish Netherlands, and the breakaway Dutch provinces, you don't just need a degree in history, you need to be pretty good at geometry too, and biology. It's very complicated. Isabella, the ruler of the Spanish Netherlands, was married to her cousin, Albert. So they were both Habsburgs, and together they ruled the Spanish Netherlands. And this Habsburg connection is crucial, because Isabella was also the daughter of Philip II, the Habsburg King of Spain, who, you may remember, was King of England too, when he briefly married Queen Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII. Now, Philip's dream was to restore Catholicism to England. That's why he sent over the Spanish Armada to conquer England. However, back in the Spanish Netherlands, Philip's daughter, Isabella, didn't want war with England. She wanted peace, because Isabella's dream was to restore a united Netherlands. And that's also what Rubens wanted. In 1621, Albert, Isabella's husband and cousin, died. And that left Isabella as the sole ruler of the Spanish Netherlands. And so heartbroken was she by Albert's death that she retired from courtly life and became a nun, a poor Clare, as they were called. From now on, she ran the country from a monastery with the help of her closest political advisor, her court painter, Rubens.
As the greatest artist in Europe, Rubens was welcomed at every court. Everyone wanted to be painted by him. And while he was painting them, well, there was lots of time, wasn't there, to discuss a bit of politics. Share some confidences. Make a couple of suggestions. Back at the 80 Years' War, Isabella, hoping to achieve peace, needed Spain to ally herself with her historic enemy, England. So she sent her best diplomat,
Rubens
To Spain, where his task was to persuade the new Spanish king, Philip IV, who was Isabella's nephew,
to enter into a new alliance
with Charles I and England. And that's why, in 1629, having smooth-talked Philip IV round to Isabella's way of thinking, Rubens arrived in London and set about charming Charles I as well.
This was actually painted by Rubens's greatest pupil, Van Dyck. It still hangs in Buckingham Palace today. How do you get a king to eat out of your hand? You put him on a big white horse and give him the bearing of a mighty warrior. It's what's called the Rubens way.
and it didn't stop there. To ingratiate himself further with Charles I, Rubens offered to paint the ceiling of this famous building here, Inigo Jones's banqueting house in Whitehall.
It's the only great painted ceiling by Rubens that's still in situ in the place for which it was painted. All this art, all this effort and time and invention lavished on England in the pursuit of peace.
Do you know what? It worked. All this cunning artistic diplomacy by Rubens worked. And to thank Rubens for his diplomatic services, Charles knighted him and also gave him a diamond-studded hat band for his hat.
For Rubens, though, enough was enough. He was a painter, not a diplomat. Having successfully engineered a peace between Britain and Spain, the Henry Kissinger of the Baroque returned to Antwerp and gave up politics forever. From now on, Rubens's attention was claimed fully by his day job and by the other great love of his life, women. Isabella Brandt had died of the plague in 1626, and a lonely Rubens needed to find a new wife. The one he found, Hélène Formand, would become one of the most painted women in art.
Hélène Formand was 16 when she married Rubens, and he was 53. Now, in those days, it was less of an issue, but it was still unexpected.
Rubens's friends thought he'd choose a countess, or maybe a duchess. That's how high he'd climbed up the social ladder. Instead, he chose the daughter of a tapestry salesman. Homely, unpretentious, and beautiful, in a full-bodied Flemish way.
Rubens was always a very sensual painter, very physical, unusually physical. And his art often makes very clear how much he enjoyed the pleasurable side of marriage.
Hélène Formand begins to appear and reappear in his pictures with remarkable frequency. Sometimes she's a country girl, sometimes a goddess. Sometimes she's all over the place and pops up throughout the picture. And sometimes she's entirely undisguised. Rubens's wife mother of his children, the woman he loves.
This is the most notorious of his depictions of her, Hélène Formant in a fur coat. It's notorious because, well, you can see why, can't you?
It's not every day that a great painter shows us his wife like this. She's just had a bath, and as she steps towards us, she's grabbed a handy bit of fur and wrapped it round herself to cover herself up. But the fur's not doing very well, is it? There's more of Hélène Formant poking out than poking in.
It's actually another clever bit of role-playing. She's meant to be Venus, the goddess of love, the most famous woman ever to step out of the sea, naked and wet. And it's Venus in a particular guise, what they call Venus pudica, the shy Venus.
It's the same Venus that Botticelli painted in his most famous picture, coming out of the sea, covering herself up so shyly. But look how vividly Rubens updates her shyness. How real he makes it.
There's an awkwardness to her, isn't there? As there would be if you had to stand about like that. But the fur coat, that's a brilliant touch, which plucks her out of the clouds and brings her right back down to earth in Antwerp in the 1630s.
I love her dimply knees and that soft tummy of hers. That's not the tummy of a goddess. That's the tummy of a real woman. Rubens has cast his wife as the Venus of Antwerp, but he's also worshipping her evident humanity. A happy man in a happy marriage is making clear in his art how he feels about the woman he loves. Isn't that marvellous?
I think we need a summary to count up all the things that Rubens achieved. 1. He painted some of the most exciting and dramatic religious art of the Baroque era. 2. He painted some very entertaining mythologies and broke world records for filling his pictures with cheeky cherubs and fleshy nudes. 3. He was a great portraitist. His portraits are so vivid and compelling. Particularly his portraits of his wives. How touching they are. 4. Size-wise, his scale is unchallenged. No one painted art as big and as ambitious as Rubens's art. Which takes me straight to number 5, which is how madly inventive he was. Everywhere you look in Rubens, something remarkable is going on. 6. Technically, he was as good as any painter has ever been. A wizard of the paintbrush who made the paint sing and the colours dance. 7. He collaborated with some of the best artists of his time, and the results of this exciting pictorial democracy are glorious. 8, and this is something I haven't even had time to deal with yet, but believe it or not, Rubens designed wonderful tapestries. And at the convent of the Poor Clares in Madrid, you get a really good sense of how big and spectacular his tapestries were. 9, and I haven't been able to fit this in either, he was an architect. And the Church of the Jesuits in Antwerp, with that superb facade, that was Rubens's handiwork too.
So here's a man who could achieve all that. Surely he couldn't do any more. Well, actually, he could, because Rubens was also a great landscape painter. And that is number 10.
When Rubens married Hélène Formant, they moved out here to the Château d'Estaing, the great country house they shared so happily, where Rubens's art put on its wellies and began filling its lungs with fresh country air.
This part of Flanders, around the Château d'Estaing, is called Brabant, and this was his inspiration.
Oh look, some goldfinches. Oh look, a kingfisher. In his revolutionary landscapes, Rubens's brush explores the Brabant countryside like a happy dog. No one had painted landscapes as fresh and airy as these before. And look how big they are, and how far away the horizon seems in these endless panoramas.
He did night scenes too. There's a particularly beautiful one at the Courtauld Galleries in London. The evening sky twinkling with dreamy stars, and such a gorgeous atmosphere of romance. Rubens at his soppiest, melting the hardest heart.
But he could do storms too. They're some of the fiercest in art. You wouldn't want to be out in a Rubens storm. Rubens's views from his window celebrate nature's many moods. Having reinvented everything else, Rubens, at his final contribution, reinvents the landscape too. That's the kind of man we're dealing with here.
Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying. That's tomorrow will be dying.
In 1642, a terrible civil war broke out in England. Brother attacked brother. Friend betrayed friend. The nation was torn in two. To ensure this dark moment was never forgotten, Britain needed an artist to step forward and witness her turmoil. Fortunately, such a man was found.
History doesn't often feel graspable, does it? Touchable, under your nose. It's usually something that takes place far away, out there, in the past. You can read about it in books. You can learn about it from David Starkey on the telly. But where it really counts, in here, You can't really feel it.
Unless, that is, something or somebody manages to bring it back to life for us. Make it tangible. Give it flesh.
There's only one way that can be done, with art. It's what art's really good at. Capturing the moment. Taking you there. If an artist is eloquent enough and talented enough, then even an event as chaotic and unruly as the English Civil War can be brought back to life and felt again.
This is a film about a lost genius of English art. A painter of deep and real talent. Who was there and who put a face to a particularly traumatic moment in our history.
His name was William Dobson. He's the one in the middle, the handsome one with the cavalier ringlets and that combative stare. Dobson was the first truly great British painter, our first native genius.
If you've never heard of him before, don't beat yourself up about it. Most people haven't. History isn't always fair to its heroes. And William Dobson was certainly one of those.
Dobson had an exciting life to go with his exciting talent. It was short and fateful, because these were not relaxing times. Dobson was born in London in 1611 and baptised in this fine city church, St Andrew's, Holborn, on March the 4th.
The register of his birth has survived. It's one of just half a dozen documents of the times that bear his name. We know that his father, also called William Dobson, was prosperous, a gentleman, it says here. But he frittered away the family fortunes on what his contemporaries called licentious living. Dobson Sr., it seems, wasted his estate on women. And you know what they say about the sins of the father, how they're visited again upon the son. Well, that certainly seems to have been true in this case. Our William Dobson, the first great English painter, would also gain a reputation for loose living.
We don't know exactly what went wrong with the Dobson family fortunes, but something did. And in around 1625, Dobson Jr. was forced to start making his own living. So he decided to become something rather ungentlemanly and un-English. He decided to become a painter.
Mind you, William Dobson could not have picked a better time to become an artist. Because there hasn't been a better time. The English king, Charles I, was an unusually cultured monarch. Charles loved art with a passion that England had never seen before in a king. Look how superbly he rides into history in this fine Van Dyck that now hangs in Buckingham Palace.
Buckingham Palace hadn't even been built in Dobson's time, and the king didn't think much of this place either, Windsor Castle. He allowed it to fall into ruin. Instead, the king preferred to reside in another of his sumptuous palaces, one which isn't even there anymore, at Whitehall in London.
Whitehall Palace was the largest palace in Europe. Located roughly where 10 Downing Street is today, it burnt down in 1698. Bigger than the Vatican, bigger than Versailles, it stretched all the way down to the river.
Whitehall was gigantic. It had 1,500 rooms. Yes, 1,500. And the plushest of them were filled to the rafters with great art. If you think Windsor Castle looks impressive today, you should have seen Whitehall Palace in around 1630, when William Dobson must first have encountered it.
All these mantegnas were in Charles's collection, 9 of them. The first Rembrandt ever to leave Holland hung in Whitehall in the longest gallery. And naughty Veroneses displaying such un-English nudity. And this famous Leonardo, now so popular in the Louvre in Paris.
Then there were all these Raphaels showing the Gospels of the Apostles, the finest cycle of Renaissance art ever to leave Italy.
What an education a young painter starting out on the road of art would have received in here, just by wandering about and looking. Dobson must have done more than that. Somehow he got the opportunity to study the royal collection in depth. And he studied it so fiercely that he ended up as good as this.
This is such a revolutionary image. You have to remember that Charles believed in the divine right of kings, that he'd been put on earth by God to command the English and educate them. Charles lavished all this money on art because he thought it was his divine duty to do so. It's what God wanted him to do, whatever the cost.
But Dobson didn't paint a divine monarch. That wasn't his way. Dobson gives us a small and troubled man, so nervous, so unsure. These are sensitive insights, and they're completely new in British art. The question is, how did William Dobson get to be this good? Not knowing the exact details of Dobson's apprenticeship is very annoying. I've stomped through the stately homes of Britain, but the information just isn't there.
You'd have thought an artist of William Dobson's importance, a man who changed British art, would have had everything about him noted down. But these are turbulent times he was living through. And when history swallowed up William Dobson, it swallowed up his past as well.
One exciting story about him is that he worked for the Royal Tapestry Works at Mortlake in London and was somehow involved with the design of these stunning hangings.
Another story about Dobson doing the rounds is that he was actually a pupil of Van Dyck, the king's official painter, who came over to London from Antwerp in 1632 and who proceeded to lord it over Charles's great golden age.
Van Dyck was the king's flatterer-in-chief, the official improver of the royal image. This is his portrait of Charles's detested queen, Henrietta Maria, a Catholic from France, whose teeth, according to the Venetian ambassador, stuck out like the guns on a battleship. But that was in real life. not in Van Dyck's portrayals of her.
But if Dobson really was Van Dyck's pupil, he was headstrong enough to see things very differently and become his own man. For one thing, Dobson could not or would not flatter. He just couldn't do it. Instead, his art makes a beeline for character and truth, for plainness, bluffness, and even ugliness.
Telling it like it is a uniquely British talent. And to show it off properly, you need a uniquely British situation. So having finally found an artist who could paint with the best, the Fates decided to test him mightily by dumping him in the middle of some of the most traumatic events in British history.
There are many complicated reasons why, in 1642, a savage civil war broke out in England. Why Parliament took on the King, Royalist took on Roundhead, and Cavalier took on Puritan.
In 1642, I knew what I had to do. Leave my home and family too, and fight for good old Charlie.
Charles had become a deeply irritating monarch. People didn't like his Catholic wife, they didn't like his foreign policy, his taxes were unpopular. They really didn't like that immodest claim of his to be God's representative on earth. But perhaps what galled them most was his extravagant appetite for art and the huge amounts of money that had been spent on it.
Many men died to uphold the law, fighting for old Charlie. Hey!
Art was an affront to Puritan thinking. The Second Commandment actually bans the making of it. Thou shalt not make any graven image, it says, of anything that is on earth or on the sea below. So for the Puritans on Parliament's side, art wasn't just immodest and popish, it was actually sinful.
But I thank God I'm still alive, fighting for...
The most notorious of all the Puritan art haters, William Prynne, published a 1,000-page book on the subject in which he stamped on dance, theatre, painting and men with long hair. The gates of heaven, spat Prynne, will always be closed to the Morris dancers.
But I had gone, he's come too late, fighting for old Charlie.
The extravagant years of Charles I had found a magnificent witness in Van Dyck. How effortlessly he seemed to capture the elegance and swagger of Charles's court.
But we'll fight on for Charlie.
Van Dyck was the perfect painter to record Charles's golden age, the days of elegance and extravagance. But when the Civil War broke out, somebody up there realised he was no longer the right artist for the job. And with a sense of symmetry that's almost scary, in December 1641, just a few weeks before the Civil War broke out, the Fates arranged for Van Dyck to die and for a vacancy suddenly to appear for the King's painter.
Dobson took over Van Dyck's job and became Charles I's sergeant painter. It should have been a cushy job, a job for life, painting royalty for royal wages. But history had other plans.
They were after me, but we were on a winning spree, fighting for old Charlie.
The first pitched battle of the Civil War was fought here, at Edge Hill, on the 23rd of October, 1642, a Sunday. The King's forces were gathered up here on Edge Hill itself, so they had the advantage from the start. The cavalry, commanded by the King's dashing nephew, Prince Rupert, charged down on the parliamentarians coming in from over there, the southwest, and sent them scattering. But the parliamentarians fought back, and the battle was to splutter on all day long, ending uncertainly, with a small advantage perhaps to the Royalists. Charles's eldest son, the Prince of Wales, the future Charles II, was at Edge Hill with his father. He was just 12 years old, and he watched the opening cavalry charges with a schoolboy's excitement. The prince narrowly escaped death when an enemy cannonball just missed him. And he was nearly captured as well in a frenzied parliamentarian counterattack. Afterwards, to commemorate the Royalist successes at Edge Hill and the presence there of the Prince of Wales, the King commissioned a portrait of his son from his new official painter, the Englishman born and bred, into whose hands the fates had unexpectedly thrust the English Civil War. This is Dobson's first great war painting. And look at the explosion in him of colour, confidence, bravado. A new mood has entered Baroque art, and it's unmistakably an English mood. Direct, foursquare, in your face. Young Charles stands commandingly at the front of the battle as Edge Hill rages behind him. His page holds up his helmet, and the king-to-be fixes us with a forceful stare. But this isn't just a portrait, it's a picture loaded with symbolic meaning, packed with it. In the end, it's not even a picture about war, really, but a superb slab of royalist propaganda about peace. The Prince of Wales, the future Charles II, represents England's best hopes for the future, the nation's salvation. See down here, the madly grimacing Fury with all the snakes in her hair. She represents the strife and chaos in the land. But look how firmly Charles commands her to stay. He's like a man ordering a dog to sit. And in the background, above the stormy skies gathered over England, a break in the clouds has appeared. The storm is abating. Peace is at hand. It's a great painting, but a lousy prediction. Parliament was in control of London, so the king needed a new base. He chose Oxford. It was excellently located, easy to guard, and all those rich colleges could be handily transformed into makeshift palaces. So for the next 4 years of the war, this was to be home for the king and his court, including the new royal painter, William Dobson. Dobson's job was to paint the king and all the other court worthies who turned up in Oxford. He was, if you like, artist in residence to the royalist cause.
He painted the king's diplomats, come hither to serve their monarch. The haughty administrators working in the king's ramshackle new court. A ship's captain who'd lost his boat. A musician who'd lost his joy. Poets, princes, and family supporters. But above all, Dobson painted the soldiers coming in from battle. The royalist heroes, the fighters, the cavaliers.
Is this a picture that means something special to you?
This is one of the portraits that I remember from childhood. I mean, for the very unartistic reason that the man in it has a very long neck. And I remember being intrigued as a child by, was that real or was that artistic license? It's one of the earliest memories that I have from the collection here is this portrait of Colonel Russell.
And when you began finding out about who Colonel Russell was, what sort of image did you create of him?
Well, I think the portrait shows a man who looks rather sort of self-important and without any form of humour. But when you read about him and learn what he did, he was involved really in the vanguard of the great years of the royalist cause. And he was a hero of that cause and a great man in his own right. And he was in charge of one of the crack regiments of infantry that the royalists had. So the more I delved into him, the more I realised that this wasn't just a courtier having his portrait painted in a sort of battle pose, but actually a genuine soldier who probably saw some pretty tough action.
That's right. You get such a sense of glamour, don't you, from these cavalier portraits of Dobson's. And we forget, don't we, looking at these handsome men with their ringlets and that sort of swaggering air, really what tough times they had to go through.
Well, it was a really brutal time, the Civil War, and you can glamorise it as much as you want, but it was really, the fighting was vicious. And in fact, Russell's regiment, when they went hand-to-hand in one fight, they were fighting with each other's muskets and staving each other's heads in. It wasn't lots of fancy cavalry charges, etc. It was brutal, visceral fighting. And I think you can see in Colonel Russell's face a sort of battle-hardened weariness already.
And that's a lot for a painter to suggest. You sound to me like someone who shares my admiration for the often forgotten, unfairly so, William Dobson.
I'm a great fan of Dobson, and I think that he's very underrated, and sadly, I'd have thought his name has almost no recognition around Britain today. But British people should know that he's the best painter that this country had produced up until that point.
The King lived here at Christ Church, Oxford's poshest college. Good morning.
Good morning.
And he brought with him the House of Commons, which met over there in the Great Hall. The Queen was here at Merton College. She took over all these rooms here, and they're now called the Queen's Rooms. Dobson, meanwhile, had to make do with lodgings in the town. All we know is that he lived off the high street, up against St. Mary's Church. So that's somewhere around here. Dispersed pleasantly about Oxford, the strangers, as the king and his court were called, tried at first to pretend that all was well in the land. In modern parlance, they were in denial. And this chap in particular, Endymion Porter, seemed determined to prove that nothing of significance had changed. Porter was a pampered courtier, a royal favourite. Before the Civil War, he'd been one of the king's main art buyers, a friend of artists and poets.
There's a fine portrait of him in the Prado by Van Dyck, in which the suave porter and Van Dyck himself buddy up together in an elegant oval.
Porter saw himself as the king's Maecenas, a fixer and tastemaker. He's the embodiment of the smarmy royal lickspittle, clinging to the king's side like a barnacle to a ship's hull. When he wasn't collecting art or writing egregious plays, Porter loved to hunt. And when Dobson came to paint him in Oxford, it wasn't as a soldier or a dashing cavalier, but as an English squire, out hunting as if nothing had happened.
Those people who admire William Dobson, and there aren't nearly enough of them, will generally tell you that this is his finest painting, Dobson's masterpiece, and it's definitely one of them. Porter stands there with his musket, while his page brings him the hare he's just shot. His loyal gun dog looks up adoringly. And to show what a fine patron of the arts Porter was, Dobson has placed a bust of Apollo, the god of the arts, at his shoulder. If you examine the symbolic figures on which he leans, you'll find embodiments of painting and sculpture and poetry. So all this stuff down here, this busy collection of symbols, has been put there to tell us what a cultured fellow Porter was, to advertise his great love of the arts. And all that is fascinating, of course. But what I find even more interesting about this picture is what it tells us about the way Dobson actually painted, the character of his art. Since Van Dyck painted Porter as well, we're in a position here to make a telling comparison. Van Dyck makes Porter thin and elegant. He brings out the greyhound in him. Dobson, meanwhile, puts a stone or so onto him, maybe even a couple of stone. He notices something English and beefy and robust about Porter. Dobson nearly always used a square canvas, and most of his sitters were painted from the knees up, from about here, which makes them look chunky and solid, like me. Van Dyck, on the other hand, was the master of the elegant full length. He preferred elongated canvases that made you look finer and taller. So the Van Dyck approach is back here, but the Dobson approach is here.
Dobson's fine portrayal of Endymion Porter gives British art its first country gent. Red-faced and solid. But the leisurely rural mood he captures here couldn't and wouldn't last. Back at the front line of the Civil War, reality had returned from the hunt. And Oxford was too busy with its war effort to pretend that nothing had changed.
All Souls was where the arsenal was, where they kept the muskets and pistols and pikes. New College was the magazine where they stored the gunpowder, and all the brass cooking vessels belonging to the townsfolk were melted down and used as bullets. Armies need uniforms, so the schools of astronomy and music were taken over by tailors, busily sewing buff coats and tunics.
And in the School of Logic, they stored the horse fodder for the cavalry, as Oxford gave its all for the royalist cause.
Someone once said, "The weak only repent," meaning only weak people say sorry. Do you know who said that? It was Byron, Lord Byron, the poet.
Now, Byron was actually the 6th Baron Byron, so he would have known something about a notorious ancestor of his. The 1st Baron Byron, John Byron, the man they called Bloody Byron.
Byron was one of Charles's most loyal supporters. He fought bravely for the king at Edge Hill, Marston Moor, Nantwich, and here too at Burford on the 1st of January 1643.
Byron was in command of a small royalist garrison of 14 men when 2,000 parliamentarians from Cirencester launched a surprise attack. The 14 royalists defended the town fiercely and beat back the 2,000 rebels.
At the height of the battle, Byron was hit in the face with a halberd. He was almost knocked off his horse, but he survived. A few months later, the king made him a baron, and Dobson commemorated this honour and the great defence of Burford with a supreme piece of English Baroque portraiture.
We're in the presence of such a haughty warrior. A black page brings him his horse, while Byron himself points to the background where the scene of his bravery at Burford is reenacted.
Those big twisty columns that Byron's standing in front of are called Solomonic columns, because people believed that these are the kinds of columns that stood in front of the great Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. They were popularised in England by Raphael in those superb tapestry designs in the Royal Collection. And they were favoured too, here in Oxford, in the porch of St Mary's Church, next to where Dobson was living. These Solomonic columns had a big symbolic meaning. They embodied Solomon's famous wisdom and steadfastness, which is why Dobson put them in the backgrounds of several of his best pictures, to represent the wisdom and steadfastness of the king's men. The parliamentarians didn't like them, though. They were too popish. And see those bullet holes up there in the statue of the Virgin and Child? Those were made by Cromwell's soldiers, shooting at this popish porch.
The parliamentarians didn't like Byron either. In fact, they hated him with a rare vigour.
They called him the bloody braggadocio, the braggart with blood on his hands. He was notoriously arrogant and cruel, and Dobson captures that, doesn't he?
I have an instinctive fondness for most of Dobson's cavaliers, But not for this man. He's too proud and showy, standing there like a Roman emperor.
Dobson's pictures tell us so much about the people who are here. He really brings them to life. But what about Dobson himself? What was he like? And what sort of life did he lead? Very little information has survived. We know that he came here with his entire family, because the church records here at the Magdalene Church show that his little daughter, Judith, died here in 1644. A year later, his father-in-law died, presumably from one of the many plagues they had here at the time, usually typhoid, caused by the cramped and squalid living conditions. We know when he got married because the wedding records have survived. And we also know what his wife looked like because he painted her. Her name was also Judith, and she's exactly the kind of woman I imagine him falling for. Bold, brassy, and magnificently bosomy. Judith Dobson would look good in a tavern, wouldn't she? She's the first such wench in British art. And her descendants are still pulling pints today in the Rover's Return and the Queen Vic. Dobson himself had what they call an irregular lifestyle. He was certainly bad with money, probably liked to drink, and seemed to have enjoyed some bad company. As for his looks, well, there we don't need to speculate, because he's left us a dramatic and swaggering self-portrait. I think it's my favourite self-portrait in the whole of British art. It hangs at Alnwick Castle in far-off Northumberland, surrounded by great Van Dycks and dramatic Canalettos. But when I come to Alnwick, what I head for is this. Before Dobson appeared, British painters didn't generally do self-portraits. Their task was to paint others, not themselves, and they certainly didn't consider themselves to be artistic heroes. That would have seemed un-English, immodest, and perhaps even a touch popish, but not to William Dobson. See those cascading ringlets, that unwavering gaze, with its delightfully British soupçon of nervousness. He rates himself, doesn't he? And strikes me as the type of chap who checks himself in the mirror. This is the first truly cocky British self-portrait, the first attempt by a British painter to make himself the hero of his own art. But, as you can see, there are two others in the picture. So who are they? And what are they here for? The fellow on the left, Mr. Chubby in satin, is Nicholas Lanier, Charles I's musical supremo, the first master of the King's music. Hear that tune playing around me? That's by Lanier. He was a skilled composer and musician, and also a collector and an art dealer. It was Lanier who pioneered the collecting of Renaissance drawings in Britain, which is why Dobson has stuck a drawing of Venus in his hand.
and given him a bust of Apollo, the god of art, to lean on. The other fellow, the thin one, is Sir Charles Cotterell, who was Master of Ceremonies for the King in Oxford, a friend and supporter of Dobson's. So why has Dobson put the three of them in this picture and huddled them up like this? The answer lies in this sumptuous painting by Veronese that's now in the Frick collection in New York, but which once hung in Britain in the palace of the Earl of Arundel, where Dobson must have seen it. The Veronese depicts a popular Baroque subject, the choice of Hercules. Hercules, that's him in the middle, has been forced to choose between two symbolic women, representing pleasure on the left and virtue on the right. He goes for virtue, as you'd expect Hercules to choose. So Dobson has adapted Veronese's pose, swapped the women for men, and turned it into this supremely cocky piece of self-promotion. There he is in the middle, the hero, the Hercules of Oxford, loyal to his king, loyal to his country, and choosing virtue, represented by the lean Sir Charles Cotterell in black, over pleasure, represented by the plump Nicholas Lanier, with his double chin and his rich and expensive satin suit. Of course, this isn't a real quarrel we're watching. It's all symbolic. The three temporary Oxfordians are pals in it together, acting out a crucial Civil War choice in which virtue triumphs over vice, as it must also triumph in the nation at large. And will you look at William Dobson at the centre of all this attention? Isn't he just loving it?
The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun,
Music played a crucial role in the Oxford court. The Civil War was tearing England apart, but the band played on. The court was full of it. Chamber music, psalms, masques. The Puritans may not have approved, but Charles adored English music and was famed for encouraging the writing and playing of it.
today, tomorrow will be dying.
So when the court came to Oxford, the royal music came with it and did what it could to raise everyone's spirits. We have very little information about who was in Oxford playing what, which is why a particularly mysterious Oxford painting by Dobson has remained one of the biggest puzzles in his career.
Then be not coy, but use.
It now hangs at the Ferenz Art Gallery in Hull and is called, oh so unhelpfully, The Unknown Musician.
For having once but lost your prime.
See the symbolic embodiments of music gathered in typical Dobson fashion at the back of the picture.
That age is best, that is.
A singing goddess, and, if you look carefully, the fragmentary remains of a shadowy lute player.
The last and worst time.
Who is this dark and sober figure in black, this particularly mysterious musical cavalier? The answer began winking at me several years ago, back in 2002, when a hitherto obscure English composer called William Laws was plucked out of the ether and dangled tantalizingly before us.
ye may forever
2002 was the 400th anniversary of Lawes's birth. Records were issued, articles written, and portraits dug up, including this one of the very young William Lawes that's been in the music school at Oxford since the 17th century. William Lawes and his more famous older brother, Henry Lawes, spent almost all of their careers working for Charles I as court musicians and composers. Young William Lawes, a lute player, was a particular favourite of the king's, and I'm now pretty certain that the unknown musician in Hull is a portrait of him when he wasn't so young anymore. Some of Lawes's finest music was written for the church. And this sad English tune, Gather Ye Rosebuds, is his most famous lyrical setting. It's soppy, I know, but heartbreakingly lovely. William Lawes fought for the king on the battlefield as well as in his songbook. And in 1645, just a few months after this was painted, he was killed at Chester, upholding the royalist cause. The king was devastated and was said to have mourned him so fiercely when he died. He called William Lawes the father of music. So for me, the clearest evidence that this is William Lawes is the mysterious bust on which he rests a caring hand. Do you recognise him? It's the king himself, Charles, lightly disguised as a classical god, seen from the side and crowned with laurel. A particularly loyal musician is swearing his allegiance to a particularly musical monarch, in a painting which, like so much of Dobson's Oxford work, brings an unexpectedly personal touch to this huge historic moment. Fortune is a fickle friend, as the royalists in Oxford were now discovering. In the Cavalier skies, storms were gathering. Over there, on that horizon, is where the Battle of Naseby was fought on June the 14th, 1645. Naseby was a disaster for the royalists. Outnumbered, outfought, they were comprehensively routed. 1,000 killed, 5,000 captured. In just 3 hours of fierce morning combat, the hopes of the Cavaliers were crushed. For Dobson too, the end game was at hand. You can actually see his art changing. Its mood darkening, the canvases growing smaller, scratchier, gloomier. The usual interpretation of this change in his art is that it was part of a more monumental failure. The royalist cause was falling apart, and so was Dobson. But I prefer to see it as something more impressive than that. As proof of his sensitivity, this unique relationship he had with the times that spawned him. Dobson was as sensitive to failure as he was to triumph. This is Rockingham Castle in Leicestershire. They have 2 Dobsons here, and they're both late works. They're not always on show.
Basil.
But I know the archivist, Basil Morgan, and he's always welcoming.
Take me to those Dobsons.
This way.
So where are we exactly in the house now? I found it quite confusing getting around it.
Well, the actual Dobsons are in the Salvin wing, put on in the mid-19th century.
And there it is. One of the last Dobsons painted, his celebrated portrait of Lewis Watson, First Lord Rockingham. Now, what can you tell us about Lewis Watson, Basil?
Well, he'd been a courtier under James I and Charles I in his younger days. And when the Civil War came up in 1642, he was very lukewarm as far as royalists are concerned.
So he wasn't a fervent royalist?
He wasn't an active royalist, no. And in 1643, the castle was taken by the local parliamentarian commander. And what is more, the king, who thought he'd been feeble about defending Rockingham, carted him off to Oxford, where he had to plead his case for a couple of years to be let off punishment, basically.
So this castle, Rockingham Castle, was taken over by the parliamentarians during the Civil War?
In 1643, yes.
Right, and Watson himself, he was here at that time? Or?
He was, he was imprisoned. He was captured by the royalists, funny enough, who thought he'd been feeble about letting this place go.
So, of course, you're very lucky here because not only do you have this superb late portrait by Dobson, but you have another one as well. You have the picture of his wife, of
Absolutely.
Lewis Watson's wife.
Yes.
And what can you tell us about her?
Well, she's a Manners from the Belvoir Castle family. The family traditionally a parliamentarian.
So she came from a parliamentarian family?
She came from a parliamentarian family. And so one of the charges against him was that she had actually led Lord Grey in by the hand when the castle was captured by Parliament.
So let's get this right. You're saying that when the parliamentarians surrounded the castle, not only did the Watsons not put up a fight, but that Lady Watson actually led them in by the hand.
That was the charge, yes.
Dobson's final paintings at Oxford are such sad and quiet things. So small and almost see-through.
The fact is, he was running out of materials. By the summer of 1645, Parliament's forces were closing in on the city, and everything was in short supply. No paints, no canvas.
The mood in Oxford had grown gloomier too. Even the most stubborn royalist was having to accept they were losing the war. This forlorn portrait of the king was painted round about now. The royal confidence has drained away. And the spirit of the times, as always with Dobson, seems to guide the painter's hand.
They lasted the winter, but only just. And after months of hesitation, the king finally sneaked out of Oxford in the small hours of April the 27th, 1646, disguised as a servant.
A few weeks later, the city fell to the parliamentarians. And those royalist supporters who remained, among them William Dobson, slipped discreetly out of Oxford and returned home.
Dobson arrived back in London in the summer of 1646, and he seems to have made some sort of attempt to continue with his career, because his name appears in the records of the Painter-Stainers Company, the Artists' Guild. But there was no point, really, because 3 months later, he was dead.
Don't ask me how or why. No one knows. There's no description, no evidence, just the bare facts of his passing supplied curtly in the parish records. October 28, 1646.
Before he died, Dobson was imprisoned for debt. And according to a brief note from his first biographer, he died very poor at his house in St. Martin's Lane, just over there. He was aged just 36. They buried him here in his local church, St. Martin in the Fields. Although inside, there's no record of him. They're rather chuffed, though, that Nell Gwyn, Charles II's notorious mistress, is buried here. And that famous maker of English chairs, Thomas Chippendale. But of William Dobson, the man who put a face to the English Civil War, there's nothing. Which can't be right. A century before Hogarth, England had a painter who painted like an Englishman. Robust, earthy, in your face. Destiny singled him out and dumped him in the middle of the most tumultuous events in British history. He was there. He saw it. He recorded it. In its tragic way, it's the perfect career. There should be monuments to William Dobson out there in Trafalgar Square. His face should be on our banknotes, his name on all our lips. Instead, there's just me wandering about in this empty church, banging on about him.
In 1642, I knew what I had to do.
But hang on, that's wrong. Of course there's more than that. Out there, scattered about the land, perhaps in a great house near you, there's a handful of the finest paintings that any British artist has ever produced.
1643, those Roundheads, they were after me, but we were on a
So go on, find one, admire it, love it, and show you care.
Fighting for old Charlie. In 1644, we fought a battle at Mastermore. Many men died to uphold the law, fighting for old Charlie. Hey,